When I think about Christmas in 1985, the first thing that comes to my mind isn't the twinkling lights or the scent of holiday punch. It's something else, something that has kept me awake ever since. I was 13 years old, living in a small town nestled in the hills of Kentucky, a place where traditions held on with an iron grip and where death wasn't something to be feared, but respected. At least that's what I believed, until that Christmas night. My grandmother Margaret, whom everyone called Granny Maggie, had passed away that very morning. She was the heart of our family, a woman with snow-white hair, hands worn by years, of hard work, and a temperament that shifted between warmth and unwavering strictness. She always said she wasn't afraid of death, but sometimes her eyes would drift into the distance, as if she knew something she wasn't telling us. In her final days, she whispered that the shadow was coming for her, but we all assumed it was just the fever making her delirious. As was the custom in our town, we decided to hold the wake at home. Her body lay in a dark wooden casket, surrounded by flickering candles that cast a soft glow on her peaceful face. The living room was adorned with white flowers, and the air was filled with the hushed murmurs of prayers and the rhythmic clicking of rosary beads between fingers. Despite the solemnity, I couldn't shake the heavy atmosphere in the house. It wasn't just grief. It was something else, something pressing down on my chest. My grandmother's house was old, with thick walls and small windows. I had grown up there and knew every corner, every creaky floorboard, every door that groaned when opened. Yet that night, the house felt unfamiliar. There was something in the silence, something I couldn't explain. As the hours passed, guests began to leave, until only a few of us remained. My mother, my aunts, and I stayed to keep vigil by the casket, as was tradition. Around midnight, the candles started to burn low, their dimming flames casting eerie, elongated shadows on the walls. Most of my aunts had drifted into uncomfortable sleep in their chairs, while my mother softly recited the rosary under her breath. I tried to stay awake, but sleep was creeping in, until I heard something that jolted me awake. It was a sound I will never forget. A cry, high-pitched, mournful, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my skin crawl. The strangest thing was that it didn't seem to come from anywhere in particular. It was just there, filling the room. My eyes snapped open, scanning the space around me. My mother was still praying, seemingly oblivious to the noise. My aunts were still sleeping. I thought, for a moment, that I had imagined it, but then it came again, louder this time. And now I was sure of where it was coming from. The casket. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break through my ribs. I slowly stood up from my chair, careful not to make a sound, and moved toward the coffin. Every step made the wailing seem clearer, more distinct. The crying didn't stop, and the closer I got, the more certain I was. It was coming. I stopped in front of the casket, my breath shallow, my hands trembling. The candlelight flickered, casting strange, shifting shadows across my grandmother's face. She looked peaceful, exactly as she had before. But something had changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I swear her lips were curved downward ever so slightly, as if she were in pain. I leaned in closer, my ears straining to catch the sound. That's when I realized something that froze me in place. The cry wasn't just coming from the casket. It was coming from inside it. I wanted to scream for my mother, but my voice refused to come out. I was paralyzed, as if an unseen force held me there, making me listen. I don't know why I did it, but my hand moved on its own, reaching for the casket's lid. Slowly, with a trembling grip, I lifted it just an inch, just enough to peek. Inside, everything seemed normal. My grandmother lay still, wrapped in the dress we had chosen for her. But then my gaze drifted to her hands. Before she passed, her fingers had been stiff, locked together by rigor mortis. Now they were different. Her fingers were slightly apart, as if she had tried to move them. I slammed the lid shut and stumbled backward, my chest tight with fear. The crying had stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse, pressing down on me like a weight. Then, one by one, the candles around the casket started going out. I watched, frozen, as each flame flickered and died until only a single lamp in the far corner of the room remained lit. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't my grandmother's. It wasn't any of ours. It was something else. It shifted along the far wall, stretching, twisting, trying to take form, but never quite managing to. It had no face, no distinct shape, but its presence was heavy, suffocating. I tried to move, but my legs refused to obey. The shadow glided along the wall, inching closer to the casket. My mother finally looked up, and the second I saw her face, I knew. She saw it too. Without a word, she clutched her rosary and began praying louder, her voice quivering with fear. One of my aunts stirred awake, confused, and reached for the light switch. The room flooded with brightness, and just like that, the shadow was gone. But the air was still thick, heavy with something unseen. None of us spoke. We stayed awake for the rest of the night, unwilling to let the darkness return. Morning arrived, but the weight of the night still clung to us. None of us spoke about what we had seen. None of us dared to. As we prepared my grandmother's body for the burial, my mother gasped. I turned to see what had startled her, and what I saw made my stomach drop. My grandmother's hands, those same hands that had been stiff in death, were now tightly clenched into fists. That was impossible. We had seen them relaxed all through the night. My mother hesitated before gently prying her fingers open, searching for an explanation. There was nothing inside, but the sight alone was disturbing enough. Then we noticed something else. Her lips, which had remained closed the entire time, were now slightly parted, as if she had been trying to say something, as if she had tried to breathe. No one spoke. No one questioned it. We finished preparing her in silence, a quiet understanding passing between us. Some things were better left unspoken. When we returned home, my mother found something that made her go pale. On the wooden table, right beside where my grandmother's casket had rested, were deep scratches. Not just any scratches, marks that looked like they had been made by fingernails. No one had been near the table that night. No one had touched it. And yet, there they were, etched into the wood as if someone had been desperately trying to hold on. From that day on, we never spoke of that night again. But every Christmas, when the family gathers, I avoid looking at the spot where my grandmother's casket once lay, and sometimes, in the dead of night, when the house is silent and the air feels unnaturally still, I swear I hear it again. A faint, distant cry. So soft it could be my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. Some things never leave us. Subscribe to Cryptic Screams. If you love chilling horror stories, terrifying mysteries, and eerie tales that will keep you up at night, then Cryptic Screams is the place for you. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Darkness awaits. Are you ready? little over a week ago, I attended one of the strangest and most terrifying funerals of my life. I'm not a superstitious person and have always considered myself to be someone with both feet firmly on the ground. But what I experienced that night in a small town in Texas changed my perception of reality forever. It all started with the death of Michael Carter, a man well known in town for his friendly nature and long conversations in the park. The doctors said he died of a heart attack, and although he was young, no one questioned the diagnosis. The wake took place at his sister's house, Lisa Carter. It was a typical old American home with wooden floors and a spacious porch illuminated by dim yellow bulbs. Plastic chairs were arranged in a circular pattern, and people arrived in silence, embracing the family before settling in to pray or whisper stories about Michael. The atmosphere was heavy, not just because of grief, but because of something I couldn't quite define. There was something in the air, an oppressive sensation that seemed to emanate directly from the open casket placed at the center of the room. I remember observing Michael closely as he lay in the coffin. He seemed peaceful, almost as if he were just sleeping. But the longer I looked, the stranger it felt. Something about his expression didn't quite fit. His face was stiff, pale, like any deceased person. But his lips appeared unnaturally, tense, pressed together tightly, as if holding something back. I thought it was just a trick of the flickering candlelight. But that unsettling feeling persisted every time I looked at him. I tried to ignore it and joined the others in prayer. It was around 2 in the morning when something happened that I will never forget. Most of the guests were dozing off or whispering in hushed voices among themselves. I stood near the casket, absent-mindedly staring at the flowers surrounding Michael's body when I noticed someone approaching the coffin. It was Mr. Howard, an old man from town, known for his strange stories and reclusive nature. He walked slowly, leaning on his cane, and bent down to take a closer look at the deceased. At first, I didn't think much of it, but then I saw it. Mr. Howard suddenly stumbled backward, nearly knocking over a vase of flowers. His face was drained of all color, his eyes wide open in pure horror. He stood frozen for a moment before, with a trembling hand and a broken voice, he pointed at the casket. His hand moved. Michael's hand moved. His statement was so clear and firm that the entire room fell silent. At first, everyone assumed he was just seeing things, maybe affected by exhaustion or grief. Some people let out nervous laughs, but I didn't. I couldn't take my eyes off the body. Without really thinking, my feet carried me to Mr. Howard's side. I leaned in to take a closer look at Michael's hands. They were still folded over, his chest, just as they had been before, and yet something felt different. I couldn't explain it, but it was as if they weren't exactly in the same position. A low murmur began to spread among the guests. Some stepped forward to see for themselves, while others remained at a distance, whispering prayers under their breath. Someone suggested it might have been a post-mortem reflex, something that sometimes happens after death. But another person pointed out that Michael had been dead for over 24 hours, making that explanation unlikely. Despite the theories, no one wanted to get too close. I, however, couldn't look away from the casket. My eyes were glued to those unmoving hands, trying to convince myself that there was a logical explanation. Then something happened that made everyone's blood run cold. The candles surrounding the body began to go out, one by one, as if an invisible force was extinguishing them. The light from the lamps seemed to dim, and for a moment, everything was plunged into semi-darkness. A strange smell filled the air, a mixture of damp earth and something rotten. The silence was absolute, so dense that it felt as if no one even dared to breathe. When the lights stabilized again, something was different. Michael's hands were no longer crossed over his chest. Now, one of them had shifted to the side, as if it had slipped down slightly. It was impossible to ignore. Everyone in the room saw it. Some people screamed. Others ran toward the exit, pushing past each other in blind panic. Lisa Carter, Michael's sister, fainted in the arms of a neighbor, and someone had to carry her outside. No one dared to approach the casket. But I felt a mixture of terror and fascination. I stood there staring, trying to find an explanation. Maybe it was an earthquake, I thought, but I hadn't felt the ground move. That's when I noticed Mr. Howard. He hadn't moved. He was still standing there, staring at the coffin with an expression I will never forget. His skin was so pale he looked like a ghost himself, and his lips trembled as he muttered something under his breath, words I couldn't understand. Then the lid of the casket began to close, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but it was moving, as if something or someone was pushing it shut from the inside. Everyone who remained in the room saw it. Paralyzed by fear, I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. When the lid finally fell with a heavy thud, the sound echoed through the house like a thunderclap. No one wanted to stay after that. The wake ended abruptly. The next day, they buried Michael without any further ceremony. Since then, I have tried to find answers, but every time I think about that night, my mind fogs over. Some say it was just mass hysteria, a shared delusion brought on by exhaustion and fear. But others insist that Michael had unfinished business in this life, and that his spirit simply wasn't ready to leave. I don't know what to believe. All I know is that every time I close my eyes, I see it again, his hand shifting inside the coffin, like it was trying to tell us something. That image haunts me. There are things you can never erase, no matter how much time passes. Images, sensations, and moments stay with you as if they were part of your skin. I was always told that children have a special connection with the unknown, that they can perceive what adults can't even imagine. But I never believed those stories, at least not until 1994, when my younger cousin died. That experience changed everything I thought I knew about death, innocence, and what might be waiting in the dark corners we never see. I was 15 years old that December, living in a small town in Texas. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where the county fair was the biggest event of the year, and where traditions carried more weight than any modern law. The death of my cousin Tommy, barely 8 years old, was a blow no one saw coming. He was a child full of energy, always running through the streets with a smile so bright it was impossible not to notice him. One afternoon, while playing near a creek that ran through town, a tragic accident took his life. They said he slipped, that the current dragged him under, and he couldn't get out. The news hit us like a hammer. Tommy was like the little son of our family, and his absence left an immediate and terrifying void. The wake was arranged quickly, as was customary, at my uncle's house. His small body was placed in a white coffin surrounded by marigold flowers. The main room was packed with neighbors, relatives, and friends, all offering their condolences. Prayers filled the air, but there was an underlying silence that seemed to wrap around everything, a silence too heavy to ignore. It was during that night, between flickering My younger cousin Ethan, Tommy's little brother, was only 5 years old at the time. He was a quiet, somewhat shy boy, but always sweet. That night, however, his behavior changed. At first, he sat quietly next to his mother, staring intently at the coffin. His gaze was unusual for someone so young. He didn't seem scared or confused. He looked focused, as if he understood something the rest of us couldn't. Later, while the adults were distracted, Ethan began moving around the room, slowly walking around the coffin. He did it with an unsettling calm, as if he were looking for something. Then he stopped, sat on the floor, and started laughing. It was a soft, almost playful laugh. Everyone noticed, but no one said anything. Some thought it was his way of coping with the loss, of processing his brother's absence. But then he spoke. "I'm playing with Tommy," he said, looking toward an empty corner of the room. An aunt, trying to ease the sudden tension that filled the air, asked him who he was talking to. Ethan simply pointed to the corner and repeated, "With Tommy. He says he wants to play like before." Those words hit us like a bucket of ice water. No one knew how to react. Some tried to laugh it off, saying that kids have wild imaginations. Others fell silent, staring at Ethan with a mix of unease and fear. My aunt tried to take Ethan away, but he refused to move. He kept staring at the corner with a strange smile on his face, as if he were truly seeing something the rest of us couldn't. Then he said something that made my "Tommy told me he doesn't like the flowers they put for him," Ethan said, still staring at the corner. "He says he wants the flowers from the yard." It seemed like just a child's innocent remark, but it wasn't his words that disturbed me the most. It was what happened next. My grandmother, visibly shaken, went outside to see what flowers were there. When she returned, she was holding a small bouquet of bougainvillea, Tommy's favorite flowers. No one had ever told Ethan that. Not even I, who was closer to Tommy, had remembered it until that moment. After that, my uncle decided to put Ethan to bed. But what should have been the end of a disturbing anecdote was just the beginning of something much stranger. Around 3 a.m., when the wake had quieted down and only close family remained, we heard soft footsteps coming from the room where Ethan was sleeping. They were light steps, like those of a small child walking through the house. At first, we thought it was Ethan, but when my aunt went to check on him, she found him sound asleep. The footsteps continued, circling the coffin, stopping for a few moments before starting again. My grandmother, who had tried to stay calm until that point, began praying out loud. Her usually firm expression showed Around 4 a.m., as some tried to sleep and others sat in silence, the candle closest to the coffin suddenly went out. The strange thing wasn't just that the flame extinguished. It was that the air felt colder, as if something had drained all the warmth from the room. That was when something happened that would haunt me forever. Ethan, still asleep, began to laugh. It was a soft laugh, full of joy, as if he were dreaming of something wonderful. But what truly unsettled me was what my grandmother found when she approached the coffin. Tommy's hands, which had been placed in a resting position, were now crossed differently, as if someone had moved them. No one had touched the body since it was placed in the casket. My grandmother decided to light more candles around the coffin, and when she did, she noticed something else. Tommy's burial clothes looked slightly disheveled, as if someone had tried to tug at his shirt or move it. I remembered what Ethan had said earlier in the night, about how Tommy was playing with him. I felt trapped between disbelief and fear. When The sun began to rise. Everything seemed to return to normal. The heavy atmosphere slowly faded, and the family started preparing to take Tommy to the cemetery. Ethan woke up, and to everyone's surprise, he seemed completely normal. He didn't remember anything he had said or done the night before. When asked, he simply said he had slept well. However, as we placed the coffin into the funeral car, Ethan grabbed my hand and said something that still haunts me. Tommy says he doesn't want to go. He says he wants to stay and play a little longer. I didn't know what to say. I just stood there frozen, watching as they carried the coffin away. That was the last time Ethan mentioned Tommy. After the burial, things seemed to calm down, but I could never forget what happened that night. Sometimes when I pass by my uncle's house, I still get the feeling that something isn't right. And although Ethan grew up and stopped talking about it, I can't help but wonder if he really stopped playing with his brother, or if he just learned to stay silent. I don't think there's anything more unsettling than the idea of burying a body that isn't there. And yet, that's exactly what happened in my town in December of 1982. It was a small place in Montana, surrounded by hills and filled with more legends than inhabitants. Back then, I was only 14 years old, but the images of what I saw and heard during those days have been burned into my mind like a scar that will never fade. This isn't just a memory of a strange Christmas. It's a memory of something that, even now, I cannot explain. It all started with the death of Harold Murphy, a man whom few in town would miss. Harold was, in my grandmother's words, a bad man. He was the kind of person who was always in trouble. Fights, debts, threats. Some said he dabbled in dark things, that he had made sinister pacts, and that he had sold more than just his soul, for money. At my age, I didn't understand much about these things, but what I did know was that his death had not been natural. They found him in his house, lying on the living room floor, eyes wide open, his face frozen in pure terror. There were no signs of struggle, no wounds on his body, but something about the way he was found made everyone whisper that it wasn't normal. No one wanted to touch him. The one tasked with collecting the body was old Mr. Julian, the town gravedigger, a man who had seen more corpses than anyone else. But this time he seemed more nervous than usual. The wake was held at the town's small church. It was not a well-attended event. Only a few neighbors showed up, more out of curiosity than respect. My grandmother, as always, insisted that we had to go. "You don't leave the dead alone no matter how bad they were," she said. So there I was, sitting in a corner of the church, watching the dark wooden coffin and listening to the prayers the priest murmured in. There was something in the air that felt wrong, as if the whole place was waiting for something to happen. The first sign that something was amiss came just before they closed the coffin. A neighbor, Mrs. Eulalia, asked to see the body one last time. It was a tradition in our town, a way to ensure that everything was in order before the burial. When they lifted the coffin lid, Mrs. Eulalia's scream echoed through the entire church. "He's not here!" she shrieked, stepping back with her hands over her face. At first, we thought she was exaggerating, but when we stepped closer, we saw that she was right. The coffin was empty. Panic spread quickly. Some started murmuring that the body had been stolen. Others claimed it had never been there in the first place. Mr. Julian swore he had placed the body inside himself. "I saw it with my own eyes," he insisted, his face pale and hands trembling, but there was no trace of the body. Not in the church, not in Harold's house. That same night, the entire town was on edge. No one wanted to leave their houses, and the few who dared to speak out said there was something strange in the air. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw Harold's frozen expression, his lifeless stare. I don't know how long it took before sleep finally overtook me, but what happened next made me wish I had never slept at all. I was awakened by the sound of commotion outside the house. My grandmother, who was also awake, opened the door to see what was happening. Some neighbors were running toward the cemetery, shouting things I couldn't understand at that moment. I quickly put on my shoes and followed them. A sinking feeling in my stomach, telling me that something big was about to happen. The town remained in silence, a forced silence, as if everyone feared that even mentioning Aurelio's name would bring him back. Days turned into weeks, and although no one spoke openly about what had happened, the tension lingered in the air. People avoided the cemetery, especially at night, and even Don Julian, who had spent decades digging graves, seemed to find excuses to stay away. But then, as December rolled around again, the rumors started. Some whispered that they had seen a shadow moving between the graves, always following the same path, always stopping in front of the crypt. Others said they heard faint murmurs carried by the wind, as if someone was trying to speak but couldn't. Find the words. My grandmother refused to acknowledge any of it, but I noticed how she started locking our doors earlier than before, making sure no one in the house was out past sunset. One night, curiosity got the best of me. I stayed awake watching through my bedroom window, my heart pounding with every rustling leaf. And then I saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim moonlight, moving slowly toward the crypt. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, but deep down I knew it was him, or at least whatever remained of him. He stopped in front of the crypt just like before, standing motionless as if waiting for something. And then, without warning, he turned. Even from a distance, I felt his gaze pierce through me. I scrambled away from the window, my breath caught in my throat. I didn't sleep that night, nor the next. Eventually, I forced myself to believe it was a trick of the mind, a leftover nightmare from that terrible December. But even now, all these years later, I still remember the look in his eyes. A look that wasn't just anger or sorrow, but something worse, something that made me believe Aurelio never truly left. And every time the cold December winds whisper through the trees, I can't help but wonder if he's still out there, wandering between the graves, searching for something he'll never find. I'm not someone who easily believes in paranormal things. My life has always been quite normal, without supernatural stories or events that challenge logic. But what happened to me recently at the funeral of a close friend left a mark on me, in a way I still can't explain. My name is Michael, and this is the story of how a farewell turned into a memory that still haunts me every night. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when I received the call that froze me in place. David, one of my best friends since childhood, had died in a car accident. He was only 28 years old, with his entire life ahead of him, and the news hit me like a brick. At first, I couldn't believe it. His smile, his laughter, the jokes we shared, all of it suddenly felt unreal, but the confirmation came quickly. The funeral was being held that same night at his family's home. I arrived at the house at exactly 8 p.m. The atmosphere was heavy, as if something invisible was pressing down on the air. The house was filled with family, friends, and neighbors. Conversations were hushed, and whispers mixed with prayers. David's casket was placed at the center of the living room, surrounded by white flowers and candles. They had left the lid open so those who wished could say their goodbyes. Even though I struggled to accept it, I stepped forward. David looked peaceful, as if he was simply sleeping. His face was serene, but there was something strange that I couldn't quite identify in that moment. Maybe it was the paleness of his skin or the stiffness of his hands crossed over his chest, but I felt deeply uneasy looking at him for too long. I quickly stepped away, finding a seat in one of the chairs at the back of the room near the wall. From there, I had a clear view of the casket. Everything started subtly. At first, the candles around David's body seemed to flicker more than usual, as if struggling against an invisible wind. I thought it was normal. After all, candles behave that way in enclosed spaces. But then the ceiling lights began to flicker as well. At first, it was just an occasional blink, something that could easily be blamed on an electrical issue, but soon it became more intense. The lights would go out completely for several seconds, plunging the room into total darkness, before turning back on. Each time the lights went out, I saw something that made me question my sanity. A shadow. It was tall, taller than anyone in the room, and stood next to the casket. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its shape was unmistakable. The first time, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. But each time, the lights came back, the shadow disappeared, only to reappear the next time the room was swallowed in darkness. I looked around, searching for any sign that someone else had seen it, but everyone remained focused on the prayers or their hushed conversations. They seemed completely unaware of what was happening. I tried to convince myself that it was my imagination, a trick of the flickering lights and the emotional exhaustion I felt from losing my friend. But the more I tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. Then, in one of the moments when the light went out, the shadow was closer to the casket. It was no longer just standing beside it. It seemed to be leaning over David's body, as if whispering something to him. My heart pounded, and a cold sweat covered my forehead. It was impossible to ignore now. I felt an urge to stand up, to step forward, and confirm that what I was seeing wasn't real. But something stopped me. An indescribable primal fear kept me frozen in place. Suddenly I noticed the atmosphere in the room had changed. The air felt heavier, filled with a strange scent, like flowers mixed with dampness. The candles began to go out, one by one, until only the dim glow of the lamps remained, and then the light went out completely, leaving the room in absolute darkness. I have tried to move on, to convince myself that what I saw was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the nights have not been the same since that funeral. Every time I close my eyes, I find myself back in that dimly lit room, facing the coffin, waiting for the darkness to consume everything again. The shadow remains in my memories, etched in the deepest corners of my mind, whispering without words, existing without form. Some nights I wake up in a cold sweat, convinced that if I turn my head, I'll see it standing there in the corner of my room, just watching. Days turned into weeks, but the unease never left me. I stopped talking about that night with anyone, afraid of being labeled as paranoid or delusional, yet I couldn't shake the sensation that something had changed within me. I avoided passing by cemeteries, avoided funerals, even avoided looking at photos of Daniel. Every time I did, I felt a presence creeping up behind me, an unseen force pressing against my shoulders. I started leaving lights on when I slept, but it didn't matter, because the shadow didn't need darkness to exist. One evening, exhausted from another sleepless night, I decided to visit Daniel's family again, hoping that being in their home would give me some closure. When I arrived, his mother greeted me warmly, though her eyes carried the weight of sorrow. We sat in the living room, the same place where I had seen the shadow. The atmosphere was lighter now, as if time had gradually washed away the lingering grief. But as my eyes wandered across the room, something made my breath hitch. The rug had been replaced, the furniture slightly rearranged, and where the coffin once stood, a large piece of furniture covered the exact spot. I hesitated before asking, "Did something happen to the floor here?" Daniel's mother gave me a tired look and nodded. "There was a stain we couldn't remove," she admitted. "It appeared after the funeral. We tried scrubbing it, even hiring professionals, but nothing worked. So we decided to cover it." A cold chill ran down my spine. I wanted to ask more, but I already knew the answer. That wasn't just a stain. It was the same dark mark I had seen that night, the one that stretched from the coffin toward the center of the room. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to stay composed, but inside my mind was screaming. As I left their house, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stepped too close to something I was never meant to witness. That night, I slept with the lights on again, but deep down I knew it wouldn't help, because whatever had been in that room, whatever had lingered in Daniel's final moments, was still with me, and somehow I feared it always would be. They say Christmas is a time for family, for happy memories, for lights that drive away the darkness of winter. But for me, ever since 7 years ago, Christmas has become synonymous with loss, fear, and something I still struggle to fully understand. It's difficult to share this story because I know how absurd it sounds, but every detail of that night is burned into my memory like a tattoo that cannot be erased. It all began on December 25th, 2016, in Austin, Texas, during my mother's wake. She had passed away the day before, on Christmas Eve. It was sudden, without warning, a heart attack as she finished decorating the tree. There was no time for goodbyes, no explanations. The blow was brutal, as if the ground had been ripped from beneath our feet. My mother was the pillar of our family, the one who kept us together, and her absence left a void that could never be filled. We decided to hold the wake at home, just as she would have wanted, surrounded by those who loved her. The wake began in the afternoon. The living room was filled with flowers and candles, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of funerals, a mix of wax, incense, and wilting flowers. Friends, neighbors, and family arrived one after another, offering their condolences. It was a strange atmosphere. The Christmas lights still hanging in the living room felt out of place, as if mocking our grief. Everything seemed to proceed as normally as a wake could, but around 9 p.m., everything changed. In the middle of the murmured prayers and quiet sobs, a woman no one recognized appeared at the door. She was tall and thin, with grey hair pulled back into a tight bun. Her clothing was old-fashioned, a black dress that looked like it belonged to another era, and she held a rosary in her hands. She didn't greet anyone. She simply walked in, as if she were just another invited guest, and approached the casket. From the moment I saw her, I knew something was off. It wasn't just that no one seemed to know her, it was the way she moved, slow and deliberate, as if every step had a purpose. She stopped in front of the casket, leaned slightly forward, and began whispering prayers. They weren't the usual prayers everyone knew. Her words were strange, like an ancient language or something learned in secret. No one interrupted her. Maybe it was the shock, or maybe the respect that mourning inspires, but everyone just watched in silence. When she finished, she reached into her purse and pulled out a letter. With delicate movements, she placed it on my mother's chest, right above her crossed hands. Then she turned toward us. Her gaze moved across the room, scanning each of us as if she wanted to memorize our faces. Her eyes were dark, but they shone in an unsettling way. Finally, without saying a single word, she left the house. The discomfort in the room was palpable. No one knew who that woman was or what exactly she had done. Some people tried to find her outside, but there was no trace of her. The only thing she left behind was the letter on the casket. My aunt was the first to pick it up, her hands trembling. The paper was yellowed, and the handwriting was almost too perfect. The note read, "See you soon." That simple phrase filled the air with something I still can't describe. It wasn't fear, not in the conventional sense, but there was a feeling that something had shifted, as if those words were some kind of sentence. My aunt tried to get rid of the letter, but my grandmother insisted that it should stay with my mother. "She knows what she's doing," she said, though no one understood what she meant. That night, after most of the visitors had left and only the closest family remained, we decided to rest for a while before taking the body to the cemetery the next day. The house was completely silent, except for the faint crackling of the candles burning beside the casket. I lay down in one of the bedrooms, but sleep wouldn't come. I closed my eyes, but my mind kept returning to the image of the woman. Her piercing gaze and the eerie message on the letter. Eventually, exhaustion won. Even after all these years, every Christmas Eve, I feel the same unease creeping into my bones. It's not just a memory. It's as if something is still unfinished, like a thread that was never cut. Every time I close my eyes, I see her again. The woman in the black dress, whispering words that don't belong to this world. I've tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a mind tormented by grief, finding horror in the unknown. But deep down, I know the truth. That night was real, the woman was real, and whatever she did, whatever she whispered into my mother's ear, it left something behind. Over the years, strange things have happened in our home. Flickering lights on Christmas Eve, shadows that move just beyond my line of sight. And, worst of all, the dreams. Those endless dreams where I'm back in that room watching her, unable to move, unable to scream. I wake up gasping, my skin covered in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But no matter how many times I try to shake it off, I know it's not just a dream. It's a warning. Last Christmas, something changed. I woke up in the middle of the night to a strange sound coming from the living room. At first I thought it was just the wind, but then I heard it clearly, a whisper, soft and deliberate. My body froze. The voice was familiar, chillingly familiar. It was the same murmuring I'd heard that night 7 years ago. I gathered all the courage I had and walked toward the living room, my hands shaking, my breath shallow. The room was empty, except for one thing. On the table, right where my mother's coffin had been placed all those years ago, there was a piece of paper, a small yellowed note. My blood ran cold as I stepped closer, my heart pounding against my ribs. With trembling fingers, I picked up the paper and read the words written in that same perfect handwriting, "Nos veremos pronto." I dropped the note as if it had burned me. My legs nearly gave out beneath me. The world around me blurred as a suffocating dread wrapped around my chest. It was impossible. It didn't make sense, but it was real. The note was real. She was real, and she had never left. Now, as another Christmas approaches, I can't shake the feeling that my time is running out. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I know this isn't over. Every night I hear whispers in the dark, growing closer. Every time I close my eyes, I see her waiting, watching, and I know that one day, maybe tonight, maybe next Christmas, I will wake up and she will be there, waiting to take me with her. The air that night had a different weight. It was the kind of cold that doesn't come from winter, but from something deeper, as if the very atmosphere knew that something bad was about to happen. I will never forget Christmas of 2010, not because it was particularly happy or memorable, but because it changed my perception of what death truly means. Until that day, I thought funerals were just a closure, a farewell. But what I witnessed in that chapel made me understand that sometimes a burial is just the beginning of something much darker. My name is Michael and I'm from Texas. I was 23 years old when this happened. My friend Ethan's family had suffered a loss right on Christmas Eve. His uncle Richard, a reserved man with a troubled past, died suddenly of a massive heart attack. It was an unexpected death, but for some of the people at the funeral, it wasn't surprising. There had always been whispers in the family that Richard had debts to settle, not with people, but with something far more sinister. The ceremony took place on December 24th in a small chapel on the outskirts of the city. It was a humble place with adobe walls and wooden pews that creaked under the weight of the mourners. There were no grand The priest arrived late, which was already unusual. He was an older man with a gaze that seemed both exhausted and alert, as if he knew more than he let on. From the start, I noticed that his demeanor was odd. He didn't begin the Mass with the usual words, and as the ceremony went on, he paused frequently as if searching for something he couldn't find. His voice faltered at times, as if he was unsure of what he was doing. But the most unsettling moment came when he started murmuring in a language none of us recognized. It wasn't Latin. There was something about those words that didn't sound like part of any religious ritual. They were guttural, rough, and although I couldn't understand them, I felt they weren't meant for us, the living. Everyone in the chapel exchanged confused glances. Ethan sat beside me, pale, his fists clenched over his knees. I knew he had noticed it too, but neither of us dared to move. The priest kept his eyes fixed on the coffin as he muttered those strange words. It seemed like he was speaking directly to Richard, or perhaps to something else near him. When he finally finished, he gave us a look I will never forget. A mix of compassion and warning. At the end of the Mass, as some people approached the coffin to say their final goodbyes, the priest pulled Ethan and his father aside. I tried to get closer, but they kept me at a distance. I don't know exactly what he told them, but I remember Ethan walking. A few hours later, during Christmas dinner at Ethan's house, things took an even stranger turn. Although the family tried to maintain a festive atmosphere, there was a palpable tension in the air. Richard was a topic no one wanted to discuss, but his presence seemed to linger in every corner. Ethan was restless, and I noticed him glancing at the windows repeatedly, as if expecting to see something outside. I tried talking to him, but he barely responded. Only at the end of the night did he finally confess something that sent chills down my spine. He told me he had a dream, or at least that's what he thought it was. In the dream, Ethan was back in the chapel. But this time, there was no one else there except for his uncle's coffin. The candles were going out one by one, and the air filled with a metallic smell like blood. Suddenly, figures began emerging from the shadows. They weren't people, but they weren't entirely unreal either. They had human shapes, but their faces were blurred, like smudges of smoke trying to solidify. They moved slowly toward the coffin, surrounding it, as if claiming it. Richard was sitting inside, his eyes wide open, staring directly at Ethan. "Don't let me go with them," was the last thing he heard before waking up. Hearing his description made me uneasy, but I tried to calm him down, telling him it was just his mind playing tricks on him due to the stress of the funeral. However, Ethan didn't seem convinced. He insisted that what he saw wasn't just a dream, it was a warning. That night, when I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about what he had told me. There was something in his voice that made me believe him. Even the following nights at Martin's house were filled with tension, each shadow stretching unnaturally across the walls, each whisper of wind carrying an eerie undertone. The family, already on edge, barely spoke, their exhaustion evident in their hollowed eyes. Even those who had dismissed the strange occurrences at first were now forced to confront the unsettling reality. Something unnatural lingered among them. The priest who had officiated the funeral was never seen again. No one knew his name or where he had come from. When Martin's father attempted to contact the church to ask about him, they found no record of any priest matching his description. It was as if he had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only the chilling memory of his strange guttural prayers and the dreadful realization that they had witnessed a ritual meant for something far beyond human comprehension. Martin's mother insisted on burning every item that had belonged to Ramon, hoping to sever whatever connection had been established that night. The fire crackled in the backyard, sending dark smoke spiraling into the sky, but instead of offering relief, it filled the air with the scent of decay, as if Martin and I lost touch over the years, but the last time I heard about him, he had changed his name and moved to a different state, far away from everything that had happened. Some say he became deeply religious, always keeping a rosary in his pocket and avoiding cemeteries at all costs. Others say he no longer sleeps in complete darkness, keeping a candle burning at night, as if afraid of what he might see in the shadows. As for me, I still struggle with what I witnessed. There are moments when I walk past a church and hear the echoes of a priest's voice, and I find myself holding my breath, listening for something hidden beneath the words. I haven't attended another funeral since that night, because now I know that not all masses are meant for the living. Some are invitations for those who lurk just beyond the veil, waiting for a way to step through.